Butter is back, canola is questioned, and beef tallow is trending. Have the facts about fat really changed, or is just the story? Welcome back to Rooted and Restless. I'm Marianne Smith Edge. And today we're going to talk about a very hot topic that has been on people's minds and in the headlines: dietary fats. And who better to talk about it than my friend and colleague and fellow registered dietitian, Connie Diekman, a St. Louis-based dietitian, food and nutrition consultant, and a former president of the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. When it comes to dietary fats, Connie is my go-to expertise. Not only has she spent several decades in the whole aspect of coronary heart disease, but she also was president of the American Heart Association chapters in St. Louis and Missouri. Connie is also on the National Cottonseed Oil Association Advisory Board, but her opinions are her own, and there is no sponsorship in this segment. So Connie, thank you so much for being on today. And as we've talked previously, we could talk hours rather than minutes about dietary fats. But I think the big one, let's start with the whole aspect of seed oil. You know, years and decades, and you can give us the history. We transitioned from what we considered saturated fats and said seed oils, soybean, corn, canola were all a better profile for overall health. And then in the last few months, not that there hasn't been questions over the years, it suddenly seems like it's blown up that, well, maybe not so fast. So let's hear your insights. The key is, how has the narrative changed? Has the research really changed, or is it just a story? And really, what's causing some of this discussion?
Thanks, Marianne. It is a pleasure to be here and to talk this topic, which still remains one that I find totally fascinating and a great deal of fun to talk about. So yes, we could go on forever and ever, but here's what we know. And well, maybe before I even say that, I should say to all your listeners, remember, science is not static. It is constantly evolving. And that's an important thing to keep in mind. But if we look at, as you alluded to, my decades in cardiovascular disease, which is a frightening statement, but the body of evidence as it relates to saturated fats and their impact on cholesterol and therefore heart disease, it's good. It's extensive. It is repeated over and over and over with quantity of studies that show conclusively saturated fats elevate your LDL cholesterol, which is the bad cholesterol that causes your risk for heart disease. Sort of the good news on this is, back when I started all this decades ago, we were seeing a high incidence of deaths due to cardiovascular disease. And the research was indicating if we could pull out the saturated fats, replace them with unsaturated fats, deaths would go down. And that has happened. So people now don't understand, well, wait, if deaths are down, why do we have to worry about it? The reason we have to worry about it is the body of evidence is clear, and it continues to be clear. Too much saturated fat, too much LDL, your heart disease risk goes up. Let me add one caveat on that. Of course, we're all genetically different. So how much your risk goes up versus my risk, that's an unpredictable because it's based upon your genes. So can I guarantee to anyone, if you lower your saturated fat, your cholesterol will come to normal and your heart disease risk will go away? No, it doesn't work that way. But I can, as a registered dietitian, say, controlling your saturated fat intake will help you reduce your risk of cardiovascular disease.
So I think you've put the statement out there that there's definitely a reason why we have moved away from saturated fats in our limit, so to speak. But what's been the flurry recently around seed oils? We've talked it because and I think omega-3s, omega-6, and some of that, the ratio has definitely been called in question. And is that inflammatory? So I'd love your take on some of the concerns that have been raised.
Yeah, some of the mis and disinformation that's out there on seed oils.
Right.
Yes, yes. We have a media, and having been a member of the media for a lot of years, this is not a diss on the media because it was a significant part of my employment. But when you look at our media in today's world, it's everywhere. You can say pretty much anything you believe on social media. We as registered dietitians can't do that because we have a code of ethics. The Federal Trade Commission is supposed to look at misinformation, but of course they're overwhelmed on social media. So it's very easy on social media to get out there and say, hey, I tried this and it helped me with that. And all of a sudden it becomes fact. That's what's happened in the seed oil arena, is some influencers have decided that, oh, there's unsaturated fats in seed oils. That causes inflammation, which is not accurate. Therefore, they're bad for you. Seed oils are very high in the unsaturated fats, which again, body of evidence shows helps reduce risk of cardio. If you take out saturated and put in unsaturated, your risk of heart disease goes down. That's decades. We're talking, and I wasn't doing it then, but we're talking going back to the 50s. So, it's concrete. The issue with inflammation is there have been some small studies, as you alluded to, the whole ratio thing. This is where it gets, I think, for the consumer so complicated. And we as dietitians, health professionals need to remember, we talk about saturated fats. The consumer thinks, here it is. We know there's a multitude of types of saturated fat. Same with the unsaturated. And that's where the distinction comes in. If you're using a whole lot of what we refer to as the omega-6, in theory, that should cause inflammation. But new studies are beginning to look very specifically at 6 versus olive oil. One out of Montana State. Very good study, randomized controlled trial, looked at it very precisely. And there was no increase in inflammation with this. It was cottonseed oil, but it's because of its omega-6 versus the olive oil, which is omega-9. There was no difference. There was no difference. What the studies are beginning to identify, it is about a lot of the foods we eat that have a lot of added fats, and those tend to be oils. So it's a quantity issue. Just like when you gain weight, it's a quantity issue. We need to shift our balance a little bit. And of course, as Americans, and you and I living in the middle of the country, we don't eat a lot of omega-3 because it comes from fish. And we don't see the amount of fish that our colleagues on the coast do see. So, it's social media influencers have made confusion, misinformation. Consumers don't understand the depth of the whole science, and it's not their job to understand it. And then trying to communicate it in a way in which it's easier for them. We do a good job. We could do a better job. We could make it simpler for consumers.
Well, I think you bring a good point. In so many cases, it comes down to the quantity. In toxicology, it's known as dose makes the poison, and even in eating, in some aspects, the quantity becomes the issue. In that aspect.
Yeah.
So
it's a perfect statement.
So even though we know what the body of science says, public perception and marketing, and have you seen from your perspective, and you work across the food systems as well, that people suddenly changing from seed oils, in restaurants or in some of the just the oils that are being used, maybe even in some packaged goods, that suddenly, kind of taking that lead and create, perhaps even creating more of a sense of urgency.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm sure restaurants here in St. Louis hate seeing me walk in the door because, oh, hi, could you tell me what kind of oil you fry your foods in? And they are changing. And when I ask them, well, why'd you make the switch? Consumers ask for it. And let's be real, restaurants are a business. They want the customers. They're going to serve the customer need. That doesn't always mean the restaurateur believes what the customer is asking, but it's to serve their customer. So it when we talk the education piece, it's not just those we deal with directly. We need to think, as you just alluded to, in terms of, okay, what about the food service system? What are they hearing? What are they understanding? The good news is, as you and I both know, a lot of our colleagues do work within the food system, so that they are working to try to communicate. Okay, first of all, let's look at that menu from the standpoint not only of what you use to fry, but how many of your items are fried? Are you setting the consumer up that they're going to get too much fat, no matter what the kind of fat? Are you finding a balance in terms of what you serve? From the standpoint of explaining it, again, that's where it gets tricky, other than if we can because as I understand it from my chef colleagues, beef tallow does fry up very nicely and it yields a nice end product. So, if it's a good product economically, now it's not as economical as it used to be, but economically a good choice, it's a hard one to say don't use it. Oils need to be changed more often when you use them in a fryer because of their fatty acid composition. So it's really working through all these steps that we dietitians have great opportunity to help our consumers understand the evidence, shift what they do for their health, and then feel good about it.
Well, I have to go back and tell you a quick story, is that last summer we were in a Vail Valley restaurant that we enjoy, and the server came over and he apologized for being delayed. He said, but I had a table of individuals that were really concerned about some of their allergies, and he says, I kind of deal with that. And I said, oh, what was that? And he said, oh, they were concerned about what kind of oil, and was it canola oil? And I had to look at him. I said, I'm going to tell you, it wasn't an allergy. I was like,
it's a wonderful example.
I was like, so, but that's a great example. And the reality is, if enough customers, they probably changed the type of oil that they were using because of the questions that were being asked.
That's right. And certainly as we look at comments around the recently released dietary guidelines, the level of understanding about fats for most consumers doesn't go below it's a fat. So trying to look at what we talk about in terms of the fatty acids, and that's really where your impact on cholesterol is coming from. That's more than we can do. And what we need to come back to is the body of evidence shows us that too much saturated fat, and notice those words, too much. And this is where that 10% guideline does come in very nicely. But too much saturated fat is going to increase your risk for cardiovascular disease. One of the things we learned in the 80s, I think it was the 80s, maybe in the 90s, if you take out saturated fats, though, don't put in all these high carbohydrate foods. The low fat syndrome, the low fat cookies of the 80s. Yeah, that doesn't work. It is truly about saturated, reduced, unsaturated up.
It's still at the end of the day about calories in, calories out, which can be rather a boring statement, but kind of reality in that.
Yeah, you can't ignore it. Quality of calories matters, but you can't ignore the statement. Yep.
Now, let's hear from Mindy Herman, registered dietitian, food and nutrition writer, and a guru on all the latest food trends.
Hi, Marianne and Connie. Here's a quick Trends Minute on seed oils. The first few U.S. launches of products with a no seed oil claim were in 2021, with the introduction of a new line of snacks for kids. According to data from Innova Market Insights, launches with claims increased for a couple of years before quadrupling between 2024 and 2025. Snacks are the top category, with mainly coconut oil and avocado oil subbing for seed oils. And watch for greater use of beef tallow, too. Here's a quick peek. Overall launches with beef tallow jumped about 50% between 2023 and 2024, and then held steady in 2025. You certainly can expect a jump in 2026. In bakery, which is the number 2 U.S. category with the no seed oil claim, many launches with that claim don't contain any kind of oil. So declaring no seed oil clearly is a marketing tool. And will 2026 be better for butter? You'll have to wait and see.
Now, let's return to our conversation. So we've alluded to, so let's dive into the headlines that have been trending around saturated fats since the beginning of the year with the inverted food pyramid. And so, for the general public, maybe dietary guidelines for Americans don't get the excitement, but this year, it's kind of gone outside the beltway. It's become a little more exciting, and we've seen the highlight of real food, and frankly, dietary guidelines have always been about real food, but it seems like we are highlighting some of the saturated fats, as we talked about butter, beef tallow as real food, but and you talked about at the same time there still carries over the evidence-based recommendation of limiting saturated fat. So love for you to go a little bit more into what that basically limitation or recommendation is for definitely eating healthier, and your thoughts on the real food syndrome, so to speak, when it comes to some of the fats that are being highlighted.
Yeah, I think one of the positives is that they did acknowledge that limiting the percent of your daily calories to 10% or less from saturated fats is advisable to be healthy. And when we look at that recommendation, that is a recommendation that has been around through several sets of dietary guidelines, again, because of that body of evidence that I spoke about that we do have. So what that means for the consumer, that's where, of course, it gets confusing, because 10% of the calories and all of that sort of thing is tricky. But, if the consumer can think in terms of, you think about your calories for the whole day and you can only have 10% from saturated fat, that's not a lot. So if you start looking at all the animal foods, meat and butter and cheese and milk, and then you look at all the packaged or processed, my other favorite word, because of course every single food we eat is processed. But anyway, I deviate. But if you look at those packaged foods, how many of them are putting added fats in your diets? Very quickly, you can exceed 10%. What we always talk about, and it's what's on the food label, is 2,000 calories per day. And obviously everybody's different, but if you look at that 2,000, what that means is you can have 22 grams of saturated fat a day. Okay. Most people eat 3 meals. So that means, what is that? You get 7 grams per meal. A cup of whole milk is 5 grams. It's going to be tight to try to adhere to that if you're focusing on a lot of beef tallow, fatty meats, high fat dairy. And I do applaud the guidelines if you dig into them. Their guidelines say that for your protein foods, which is where the animal and dairy will be found, it does include plant proteins, nuts, seeds. So if someone, and of course we're assuming the if, were to do a plant protein for lunch and an animal at dinner, now you can have a decent portion of beef, pork, Even fish has saturated fat, not as much, but it does have it. Or you could have that whole milk at all 3 meals. Whole milk at all 3 meals, because the recommended milk on the 2,000 calorie guidelines is 3 cups per day. That's 15 grams of saturated fat. Doesn't leave you much room. That's the big challenge in this, drink the whole milk and eat the animal, as you said, I like to call it a funnel, but in that new visual, if you do everything at the high part as it is, you're going to have a hard time to get 10%. An American heart says less than 6% for saturated fat.
And what's a tablespoon of butter? I mean,
let me think here. So a tablespoon is 3 teaspoons. So it's going to be about 8 or 9.
So essentially, you're getting close. Yeah.
Yeah. If you put some butter on your toast with your whole milk, you're gonna be half your day.
You're almost done for the day.
When you look at that total fat intake, the guidelines still are at that 20 to 25% of calories. Most people are at 25, which probably is fine if it's unsaturated. So, if you eat up 10 of it with your saturated, it doesn't leave you a lot even for, oils and seeds and things like that.
Well, some people might say, well, that's a great guideline, but, I'm physically active. I work out a lot, so I don't really have to be as concerned about the saturated fat level. And just using that as an example, does that apply to everyone, or is it still?
Because it is about coming into your body. If you're up at 5,000 calories, like the swimmers I used to work with at the university, obviously their 10% is much higher than the 2,000 on the label. But the reason is saturated fat still needs to be a smaller percent of your fat intake because it is connected to the risk for heart disease. Now, there is some research that's been probably evolving, 26, 10 to maybe 15 years. And I do believe the concept is right on the money, but I don't know if we're still to the point where we have the body of evidence, but that it's about the food matrix, whether that saturated fat impacts your LDL cholesterol. So in other words, how the fats come together in the food. What else is in the food? We know if there's a lot of fiber in a food product, you're going to lose some calories because you can't digest that fiber. Does the food matrix really inhibit some of the saturated fat absorption? There have been some studies that say yes, therefore, and this is one of the research studies behind the dairy products. When you look at them, maybe it does have to do with how those chemical molecules, that's what people need to remember, how those chemical molecules come together, how they go in, and how they get digested. But as a dietitian, I will say I'm not 100% comfortable that we know that yet. I acknowledge the research and I'm following it, but I still, as I work with clients, if you said to me, I want whole milk every day, and actually I've done this with a client, she wanted chocolate candy every day, but if you wanted whole milk every day, we would work it in. But if you wanted whole milk 3 meals a day, and you want, this nice big juicy steak, we're going to have a conversation about what is your priority. And I think that's important for your listeners, whether they're dietitian, food service, or the consumer. The person who eats the diet is the one who drives the rules. They go home and consume the food. I don't. So we have to work to help them feel good about what they're doing. But we might have to do some give and take if you want more than the guidelines say you can have.
And a great point. I think, and that's probably the negative for us as dietitians, not going off of the rails here, but in the regards is why at times we've been viewed as a food police because they think it's like I'm not going to go see one because they're going to tell me what not to eat, and that's not the case. I think you bring out a really good point here. It's about balancing, what what you like but in a manner that is for the promotion of health in that regard. So I would say, so what's in your pantry when it comes to fats and oils? Dare a saturated fat enter your house, or do you?
I do use olive and canola. Cottonseed, I feel the need to say it. Cottonseed currently is used predominantly in food products and in restaurants. So we don't see it quite as much on the shelf as we see canola or soybean oil or things like that. So those are my go-tos. You and I have discussed some of the specialty oils, and I've stopped using the specialties, whether it's, avocado or grapeseed or whatever, because I don't use them fast enough. And because they are so unsaturated, they do go bad more quickly. So I've stopped that. In the refrigerator, ready for this? I do use a butter and canola oil blend. And the reason I've made that switch, I did it a couple years ago, is the consistency of it. I just prefer the texture piece, I guess, is the words that would be better describing just being on the tub margins, which I did for a lot of years. They get too mushy on my toast. So that's my personal preference. But therefore I also know, okay, that's some butter. So now I need to watch what I do. And maybe that is my balance. That's there, and then it's the other oils.
Well, I would agree with you. I kind of use the same combination of oils, and I have a husband in the house that really likes the butter. And coming from a dairy farm, how could I define not having butter? And to your point, definitely use it, but not not in the when I think it's definitely going to add to the taste of things, and combine maybe sauteing butter and other oils. But it's also, I think you bring out a good point. It's like, okay, if you want to butter your bread, then what's the other how to switch that? And so it's never about the totally absence, but kind of, again, what's important to you, and what's important to your taste, but also the fact is health is important as well.
Exactly. And that's certainly come from long longevity on my side, not only of working in the cardiovascular arena, but my grandfather had cardiovascular disease. My dad did as well. Fortunately, they both lived relatively long lives, given, when they grew up on the farm and so forth and so on. But I know, therefore, I need to be proactive instead of reactive. So I've tried to do it both for that reason, but also as a scientist who looks at the body of evidence. But that makes me happy and I'm comfortable. Does that work for my customer? Maybe not. And that's where I need to be, is where they are, not what I think.
So let's have a little lightning round. What would you prefer? Let's talk about. So when it comes to fat, butter or beef tallow?
That's a butter.
Butter.
I'd have to look at the profiles to be 100% sure, but I'm pretty sure. Yeah, butter has a little bit less saturated fat than beef tallow.
And then a butter or olive oil. That's pretty. Olive oil. Olive oil or canola?
That's what are you going to use it for? Olive oil does smoke more quickly than canola. So, you do have to watch how high you heat it, how quickly. So depending upon what I'm using it for, I would never, even though people used to say don't bake with olive oil, you can in some cases. Yes, it will have a little bit of a flavor, but sometimes it's okay. So that's really a usage question.
And I think that's important too, because then it gets down to, as you were saying, some of the oils are designed for low point and high point. And I notice now some of the olive oils, there's a certain brand that one's for sizzle and one's for drizzle concept. And so again, that would be the blending, so small. When we talk about smoke points, and again, that's why some of the oils have been used in commercial food services. What works best?
Very definitely. And obviously there's a cost difference as well. But yeah, there's no question. And this is also an area where a lot of the seed oil people are looking at some genetic engineering of their seeds to shift some of the fatty acid profile. We're seeing some high oleic acids coming out there, or, high oleic acid oils come out that traditionally would not have been bred that way. So it's an evolving market to accommodate what the customer wants for taste, convenience, and health.
So when we wrap it up on really talking about the whole aspect of dietary fats, I think a couple of things come out is definitely balance, but it sounds like it's about the quantity, and that's easy to forget if someone sees a headline that it's okay to start consuming again. So. And at the same time, when this kind of emphasis on saturated fats came out with dietary guidelines, we also saw the headlines that, once again, the Mediterranean diet was one of the best ranked. So putting that in context, what would be for if folks are really looking at, what's my next step when it comes to diets, and how do I take this fat information and diet information? What would be your recommendation or bottom line, I guess, and why we see one headline over here and one headline over here, and do the two ever meet, or in that regard?
I would say, number one, know your health risk. Then focus on what we understand at this point to be best choices. More plant foods, so more whole grains, fruits, vegetables, proteins that are plant-based, whether it's nuts, seeds, animal foods that are lean, are low fat. And then when it comes to using your fats, as you said, look at what works best for you, but don't forget, body of evidence shows saturated fats will increase your risk for heart disease.
I think that's a really good bottom line. And the reality is that saturated fats do have more calories. And it's not only the profile, but also for health. But if we're looking at the overall intake, definitely for consideration.
Yeah, and I think, the way that I lined them up, what we know, again, body of evidence, your body needs the majority of its calories from carbohydrates, because that is our fuel. Now, not excess carbohydrates, but majority. Complementary protein inadequacy. And then, as you said, that fat sits down there as the third choice, because it is more calorie dense.
But again, the good news, it's the combination.
They all go together. They all play nicely together when you keep them in the right balance. How's that?
I love it. Is that we can all play the same game as long as we keep it balanced. And
that's right.
I think that is such a good way. And one time I was being interviewed for a particular ingredient, and the reporter came back and said, well, essentially what you're telling me, it's moderation. And I was like, well, it's always been moderation. It just doesn't sell. So thank you, Connie. Again, it's always fun to connect and get your intake and to your good health in 2026.
Thanks, you
Connie.
so much, Marianne.
As we reflect on what Connie and I discussed today, I think the reality, it always comes back to food quality, but also food quantity. And when we talk about digging deeper into food, we need to realize that a lot of times headlines, food makes headlines if it's against maybe what the body of evidence is, and makes us think. But remember, dietary fats is just part of the diet. And fats make food taste good, but also there are consequences as many times is if we eat too much, it can, and eat too much of things that aren't as helpful. There are effects, whether we want to admit it or not. Some of us may be more predisposed to like coronary heart disease than others, but as we only say, we only have one body. And so it's always good to think about how we can enjoy food, enjoy the flavor, enjoy the taste, but at the same time, remember, prevention costs less than having to treat the disease if possible. So as we move into 2026, think about how we can enjoy our food with great flavor, but also recognize sometimes just look at the quantity and enjoy. So here's to your health in 2026. Food always has a story, and it's not as simple as you think. Thanks for listening. Subscribe to Rooted and Restless wherever you listen to podcasts or find us on YouTube.